All right, so now we continue now another application of AI. Now we're going to focus on poverty. So this talk is coming from MIT, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Poverty Lab, the lab that's going to present now, won the Nobel Prize this year in economics. So are you going to... Thank you. I mean, he didn't win the Nobel Prize, but his lab did. But yeah, so this is Jim. This is Jim Shen. He's the senior manager of the Innovation in Data and Experiments for Action Initiative, initiative at MIT, JPAL Global. Right. So thank you, thank you. Please welcome Jim.
Green button goes forward. Okay, cool. Hi, so I'm Jim Shen. I am the senior manager of the Innovations in Data and Experiments for Action Initiative at JPAL. As you know, Omar mentioned, JPAL is the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. We're based in the MIT Economics Department. We're a research center, and our mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring policy is informed by scientific evidence. And as he mentioned, our co-directors, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, and our longstanding affiliate, Michael Kramer, won the Nobel Prize in economics last year. So I'll be giving a brief overview of JPAL, randomized evaluations, and how we've used admin data, and finally tying it back to AI at the end. So at JPAL, we connect the dots from research to policy. We understand the constraints of policymakers and work with them to support their own policy priorities. We draw out policy insights from research, we fund new cutting-edge research through initiatives, and we engage with external sector experts. We provide funding, technical assistance, and training, and embedded staff to help shape programs and policies that deliver results. We have a network of more than 190 affiliated professors around the world who are all using randomized evaluations to answer important questions related to poverty and social policy. Our affiliated professors have conducted more than 900 randomized evaluations in 81 countries. Over 400 million people have been reached by programs that have been scaled up after being evaluated by JPAL affiliated researchers. These cover a range of sectors: agriculture, health, education, labor markets, and so on. And alongside this global knowledge, we are locally grounded through our 6 regional offices based at leading research universities around the world. Our Latin America and Caribbean office is based at PUC in Santiago, Chile, and they lead engagements all across Latin America. So JPAL's affiliates, their bread and butter is randomized evaluations, and the intuition behind this is as follows. Say we have a program to improve test scores and want to understand whether that program had an impact or whether any changes you observed was as a result of some other factors like socioeconomic status. In an ideal world, we give this program to a set of individuals, observe the outcome, go back in time, and then observe the outcome had these individuals never received the program. We can't do this, but we can achieve a similar goal by randomly assigning individuals to either receive the program, which we call the intervention group, or not receive the program, the comparison group. So because the individuals are randomly assigned, we can be sure that they don't differ systematically at the beginning of the study. For example, this assures the group that receives the test score program is not systematically better or worse off than the group that doesn't receive the program. And because the groups are randomly assigned, there will likely be differences in their characteristics at the beginning of the study, but if the sample size is large enough, we can be relatively sure that these differences are likely to be negligible. And after randomization, we can then implement the program. So because the only systematic difference between the two groups is the presence of the program, we can confidently attribute the differences in outcomes to the intervention itself. And that is, randomization allows us a causal interpretation of the difference between the intervention and comparison groups. So as we noted, a key prerequisite for this is to have a large enough sample size that spans the entire length of the program being evaluated. And typically, the traditional way of data collection has been to send out surveyors. This is expensive and time consuming. You have to pay them. They have to spend time collecting data. They might make mistakes. People might drop out of your program, and so on. And on the flip side, lots of governments, NGOs, and firms are increasingly generating and digitizing vast amounts of data. We define administrative data very broadly as any sort of data that's used for administrative purposes. And this data has a lot of potential for research, but in practice isn't widely used yet. So admin data has a lot of potential, right? You can get higher data quality because the data is objectively collected, it's representative of the population, and it's robust to attrition. It gets us larger sample sizes because it can potentially contain the entire population in question, which lets us test more treatments in an evaluation and gets us more precise estimates of the effects. It can let us do evaluations at higher speed and lower cost because the data is already available and being collected separately from the evaluation. It can save us the time and resources spent on collecting survey data. You might not get everything through admin data, particularly around things particular to a treatment being evaluated, but a lot of it might be there. And finally, administrative data lets us do research that we couldn't do before. We can combine it with our survey data. We can rapidly generate descriptive statistics for research designs and policymakers. And we can do experiments we simply couldn't do before. Sort of like our last example. One of the studies by JPAL affiliated researchers studied electoral fraud in Afghanistan, where they digitized paper voting records at polling stations before and after they were tallied up to measure discrepancies, there to try to measure electoral fraud. You can't survey people on whether they committed fraud, and if you did, you probably can't trust the results. But you can observe the effects of this by looking at the data directly. However, there are significant challenges in using administrative data, particularly around access for researchers. On what we call access modalities, there's often a lack of a legal mandate for people to access the data. There might be outdated or cumbersome data sharing policies or no policies at all that allow researchers to access this data, and also potentially little awareness around the dangers around sharing PII. The data might not be usable. They might collect it in outmoded formats and disconnected databases, and they might not have the resources in place to overhaul the systems necessary to collect and digitize this data. The provider might not understand the value of using admin data for research. They might not understand that research is possible, perceive there's high risks for sharing this data, and ascribe low benefits to the insights that research can generate. And finally, researchers and data providers often lack the technical skills to make this happen. Data providers are not typically experts in data analysis. And on the flip side, economists are not necessarily experts in data storage, transfer, and security. So the idea's core model here, we're aiming to help researchers and data providers overcome a lot of these issues. We look to build long-term partnerships with data providers to make their data accessible for research. This will involve convincing them of the value proposition of research that affiliates can produce, in conjunction with building the data provider's capacity to share and analyze their own data. One of the ways we would get buy-in is to perform evaluations on areas of mutual interest between the researcher and the data provider. And importantly, for us, we are going to set norms and standards for using administrative data for our affiliates, particularly around protecting individual privacy and data security. And towards these goals, we are working on the Handbook on Using Administrative Data for Research and Evidence-Based Policy, also known as the IDEA Handbook. This is going to be a collection of best practices on how to access, handle, and analyze administrative data, with technical chapters on subjects such as data security, as well as case study chapters contributed by affiliates and other experts on their existing partnerships and how they handled access and administrative data use to generate research results. IDEA is founded by a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Our three co-chairs are Sean Cole, Iqbal Dhaliwal, and Lars Vilhuber. Professor Cole is at the Harvard Business School and is also a long-standing JPAL affiliate, and he brings a lot of the economics research expertise and connections to IDEA. Mr. Dhaliwal is the executive director of JPAL, where he spearheaded the formation of IDEA last year. And Professor Vilhuber is both the executive director of the Labor Dynamics Institute, which works to create and make accessible data used for labor markets research, as well as the data editor for the American Economic Association, where he's involved with their data access and publication efforts. And he has a lot of on-the-ground experience with data use, publication, and privacy policies. So some of the examples of administrative data partnerships that are sort of the foundational model for IDEA. In the Dominican Republic, JPAL affiliates have worked with the Ministry of Education to use their admin data to evaluate informational programs for students on returns to education. And in this context, it was through the use of different forms of media, including telenovela-style videos, posters, and tablet-based information campaigns. And the theory here is that we can reduce dropout rates by better informing students on the benefits of staying in school. In Peru, JPAL is a partner organization involved with Minedu Lab, an innovation lab for education policy housed within the government of Peru. The lab pilots and evaluates innovations aimed at improving children's learning outcomes. Some of those things that they've been evaluating are text messaging campaigns for staff, video informational campaigns for students, growth mindset instruction, and so on. And by being embedded within the government of Peru, they have direct access to administrative data there. We also have partnerships around the world. We have a long-standing partnership through our South Asia office with the government of Tamil Nadu in India. They helped establish the data analytics unit in the state's economics and statistics department and have performed a variety of capacity building exercises with the Tamil Nadu government. This has generated 6 ongoing and completed evaluations across different sectors. And in Cape Town, the JPAL Africa office has worked with the city to unlock more of their data. They've built a special data access portal for researchers to allow them to use utility and other administrative data. And this has led to evaluations on electricity use and metering, as well as on water use during the drought of 2018. And finally, tying this back into AI a little bit, and also back in Latin America, one of the projects funded through JPAL LAC's Skills for Youth program is an evaluation on the effectiveness of information provision during the college enrollment process. And the evaluation is on whether AI chatbots that personalize the information provided to students and their families on subjects like school choice, major decisions, and financial aid are more effective than traditional approaches to information provision. And as you can imagine, using administrative data for this would be invaluable for this sort of project. If you can get the education records directly from the ministry instead of having to ask people what their grades were, that would save you a lot of time. If you can get the chat logs directly from the chatbot database instead of having to ask people what they talked about with said chatbot, this would dramatically reduce the expense of collecting data and enable you to get data on a much larger sample. And this is an example of where JPAL intersects with AI research. It's unlikely economists are going to be writing AI algorithms for chatbots or many other applications of AI, in development economics. But in collaboration with computer scientists, machine learning experts, AI specialists, we can identify areas where it makes sense to try to use AI solutions and also evaluate their effectiveness and try to improve them going forward.
Thank you. So we have time for a couple of questions. So this is actually a few times that we're touching poverty. So if you have any questions related to poverty, I think this is now the time to do it. So.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious about the legalities of accessing this data and what requirements or exemptions of the legal consent by the research subjects. How do you approach that?
So with administrative data, at least in the US context, one of the main constraints around this is what our institutional review boards will approve. And I have some experience on this, but typically admin data, we refer to it as secondary data, as in the data was already collected. And one of the issues IDEA has identified is that institutional review boards haven't quite caught up to admin data, because if you say admin data is secondary data, suddenly that removes a lot of the barriers to human subjects research because you're not directly in touch with human subjects. So that's part of what IDEA is doing is, we recognize that there's a lot of potential here, but also a lot of safeguards that we need to implement to be able to safely use admin data in the context, that we have access to a lot of people's private information. And even though we're not in contact with human subjects directly, this is still something we need to be aware of. And the two main things in the actual legal context would be HIPAA and FERPA for health data and education data. Yep.
Hi, I'm Enrique Zucar from Mexico. So if I understand correctly, with this approach, you can infer causal relations from the data. And a second part of my question is if you are also considering or using causal modeling, that is some area that has developed recently.
Yeah, so the goal of randomized evaluations is to get that causal interpretation of the effects of a program. There's lots of other approaches within the realm of economics, quasi-experimental models, regression discontinuity designs, simple regression models, and so on. JPAL as an institution, we specialize in performing randomized evaluations, our affiliates do, and that's the specific type of research that JPAL funds. Yep.
All right, guys. Thank you a lot, Jim. And please.
Thank you.